Hi, I'm Caroline, the Countess of Derby, and this is Knowsley Hall. I married into the Stanley family in 1995, and for the past 30 years, I've been on a journey discovering more and more about one of Britain's most historic families. Growing up at Audley End Estate, and then going on to become exhibitions assistant to the surveyor of the late Queen's pictures for nearly a decade, I've always been a student of history, art, and culture. And after decades of family anecdotes, studying historical records, relics and manuscripts from the Stanley archive, I'm proud to say we're now able to share an exciting and detailed account of the Stanley family history and Knowsley Hall. I've recently made a podcast about Knowsley Hall and the Stanley family with Duchess the Podcast. And now, in the following documentary, I'll walk you through the best clips from that podcast. We'll romp through horse racing, high-profile assassinations, victories in dramatic battles, direct associations with Shakespeare, a forgotten Prime Minister, all the way to revolutionary scientific discovery. We'll shed light on one of the families that truly made Britain great. So join me, your host, the 19th Countess of Derby, for this unforgettable journey. This is the Stanley family and Knowsley Hall. We start with Sir John Stanley. He was the great-grandfather of the first Earl and is the true beginning of the Stanleys as a significant family line in British history. Born in 1350, John became a hugely influential figure in medieval Britain. Despite being a younger son, and therefore unable to benefit from the full rewards of primogeniture, Sir John had a distinguished military career in France and Ireland. Combining this with marrying a wealthy heiress, Isabel Latham, he elevated the status of the family and would be appointed, among many other titles, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and King of the Isle of Man by King Henry IV of England. The Stanleys would retain their influence and proximity to the crown for centuries, but this did not mean that the Stanleys escaped brutal conflicts and existential challenges. Indeed, if British history has taught us anything, it's that proximity to the crown means that you're never far away from potential danger. The Middle Ages were a time of great peril for everyone in Britain. It was a time when one of the most divisive and explosive conflicts took place, the War of the Roses. Members of the Tudor family and King Richard III took opposing sides on that battlefield. It was at this time Sir John's great-grandson, Sir Thomas Stanley, 1st Earl of Derby, entered the fold, proving a decisive influence on the outcome of this struggle. In the following clip, presenter and historian Dan Snow and I paint the backdrop to this historic battle, the Stanley family's close relationship to both competing houses, and you'll learn how Sir Thomas navigated these disparate relationships to change the course of British history forever.
Yeah, and there's another Stanley. The son of Sir John is Thomas, and he is, how you do this, I don't know. In a world where the English political class is just tearing itself to pieces, all of the various descendants of Edward III are falling out in a big way at this point. Poor Henry VI is, in many ways, a very sympathetic king. His father, the great warrior Henry V, died too young. Henry VI succeeded as a baby, seems to have numerous mental health issues, breakdowns, and his cousins, his royal cousins, started circling the throne. You get the so-called War of the Roses, and Stanley survives all the way through that, despite being married to important people and playing important roles in that, but survives with his lands intact and ends up in the reign of Richard III, who is the Yorkist king in the late 15th century, in the 1480s. Stanley ends up in a kind of uneasy alliance with him. He is awkwardly married to the mother of one of the other claimants, the Lancastrian claimant to the throne, a man called Henry Tudor, who you'll be hearing about more in a second. And yet the Stanleys sort of just about keep on the right side of Richard III, who was, I think, quite an unforgiving man. And
I think he was made his Lord High Chamberlain or Lord High Chancellor, wasn't he?
So a sign of great royal favour. And yet at the Battle of Bosworth, when Henry Tudor lands. So Henry Tudor was actually Derby's stepson.
Yeah.
It's a bit awkward when your stepson lands in West Wales and then you're still saying to the king, yeah, don't worry, mate, I'm on your side. No, we don't know enough about this bit, do we? Don't know enough. Henry Tudor then marches across England and Wales, picking up supporters. He's got a corps of French mercenaries, the core of his army. And we don't know for sure, do we? But we think Stanley may have met him at this point.
Well, he'd married his mother 12 years beforehand, Margaret Beaufort.
She is, I think, largely responsible for getting her son, Henry Tudor, safely away to France initially, but then back to Wales, to England, where he could take on Richard III for the throne. And so she was just pulling strings and pivotal. She's an incredibly impressive woman. So her husband, Stanley, arrives at a critical point, a place called Bosworth, near Bosworth, Market Bosworth. And you've got sort of three armies at this point circling each other. You've got Henry Tudor's, this rebel army, invaders. You've got Richard III with the royal army, and he keeps saying to Stanley, come on then, mate, let's go. In fact, I've got your son as a hostage, by the way, as well. And if you don't play nice, then I'm going to kill your son. And the legendary reply came, well, sire, I have other sons.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah, that's true, is it?
It is absolutely true.
Quite the line.
And it's also been made history because it's in Shakespeare's play.
Exactly. Stanley features prominently in Shakespeare's plays.
Yeah,
Very interesting
well,
figure.
in loads and loads of Shakespeare's plays because the 4th, 5th and 6th Earl of Derby were his patrons.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There's a lesson there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Right. So that's okay. Well, that's why Stanley got such a good write-up. I never quite realised that, so thank you for that.
It's very interesting. Everyone's fascinated with Richard III. How accurate do you think the description of Shakespeare is of what now we know as the corpse and the skeleton of Richard III?
Well, isn't this one of the great questions? It's just, it never loses its appeal and people are fascinated by this. I think the answer is Shakespeare was pretty accurate. I mean, Richard III's one of the great villains of Shakespeare's plays. He is portrayed as a sort of figuratively and literally kind of twisted character. And the way he was played by Laurence Olivier in the famous film left us all with that amazing impression as well. But it makes sense because Shakespeare was writing plays for the winners, for the late Tudors and the early Stuarts, people that are all descended from Henry VII. And therefore, it was clear that he needed to create a villain in order to say, look at this glorious new era. This brilliant the new people have arrived. The Tudors and England's going to enter a golden age. So I think, as ever with Shakespeare, we should enjoy and we should laugh, we should cry, we should be moved, but it ain't a history lesson.
No.
But the battle itself is fascinating because Richard takes on Henry in this great final battle, and the Stanleys sort of watch the outcome, don't they? And then at that point, Stanley decides the fate of the English throne. Extraordinary. At the battle, they don't help King Richard. King Richard is defeated, and then it is Stanley, very appropriately, who picks up the crown from the ground, from a bush, places it on Henry, his stepson's head. Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, and everyone is very familiar with them. And I think that this is the moment that explains why the Stanley family just developed this kind of iron grip on this part of England and become one of the most preeminent families for the rest of English and British history, because really Henry VII has climbed onto the throne on their coattails in many ways.
In many ways, the story of Richard III did not end on the battlefield, or even in the theatre where Shakespeare immortalised him forever. It ended when his skeleton was discovered again underneath that Leicester car park in 2015. And his bones were laid to rest by the descendants of the 4 families that decided his fate. And still today, we can see tangible examples of how this history lives on, not only through the bones of Richard III, but also through this, the Bosworth horn, an item we found in Knowsley Hall that we've been able to trace back to the 16th century, a horn that by its very name conjures up the forces being galvanised on the battlefield and finally marked the end of the fighting. So with the death of King Richard III, you would think that the future of the Stanleys would be assured. But being a perceived threat to the crown will always bring danger. We're jumping forward around 100 years and 4 generations of earls. The 4th Earl of Derby has just died, and his title has passed to his son Ferdinando, whose subsidiary title was Lord Strange. Europe is experiencing a renaissance, and it is a great time for exploring new ways of looking at the world. Ferdinando, who upon the death of his father became the 5th Earl of Derby, was the prototypical Renaissance man. Creative, artistic and open-minded, he was a patron of the arts with his troupe, Strange's Men, who took part in bringing to life many of Shakespeare's great plays. But he would become embroiled in a succession scandal that would not only threaten the status of the whole family, but would end his life. This was known as the Hesketh plot, and in this next clip I'm joined by Dr. William Shannon, where we dive a bit deeper into the life and character of the 5th Earl, and why the mysterious details of his death have led historians to believe he was likely the casualty of a royal assassination.
Well, Ferdinando, Lord Strange, he was 35, so he's quite mature by the time his dad died. He was a poet, he was a patron of the arts, he was very different to his dad. I think his dad was a politician, a manager through and through. I think Ferdinando might have been a bit of a dilettante, and where the 4th Earl was unequivocally mainstream Church of England, shall we say, there's always some suspicion about Ferdinando. Was he a closet Catholic? Now, there are certainly those who thought he was. I think the evidence is unclear, but he began foolishly to meet with a local man, Richard Hesketh, a Catholic, Lancashire background. And Richard Hesketh was plotting a rebellion to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and replace her with Ferdinando, who he reckoned was the true rightful heir to Henry VIII.
Those times,
Yes.
You just got rid of anyone else who had a claim to the throne.
Absolutely.
It was just normal Tudor.
But for Ferdinando
policy.
to meet with Richard Hesketh, not just once, but several times, but then he realised what a dangerous game he was playing. And so he reported Hesketh to Lord Burghley, that's William Cecil, who was effectively Queen Elizabeth's Prime Minister and head of the civil service, all rolled into
Yes.
one. And Burghley did the obvious thing. Hesketh was arrested and executed.
So what happened to Ferdinando?
Well, within a matter of months, Ferdinando was taken ill and died. Now, he was taken ill suddenly, and almost certainly he was poisoned.
This series of dramatic events began with the death of the 4th Earl. And it really showed how during this period, one unfortunately timed passing could threaten a whole family line. We have a particular item from the estate that represents this, the 4th Earl's funeral book. A book that contains signatures from some of the most powerful individuals in the whole of Britain at that time, including the ill-fated Ferdinando. Another name it contains is his brother, William, who succeeded to Ferdinando titles and became the 6th Earl of Derby. From then on, the Stanleys experienced a notably less dramatic period for a generation. That was until the Civil War in Britain loomed its head once again. It's 1642 and Britain is self-destructing, experiencing the bloodiest per capita war in its history. William's son James, the 7th Earl, is now head of the family, and unlike his predecessors, he would not stand to gain anything in a conflict where Britain's greatest enemy is herself.
The civil wars, traditionally known as the English Civil War, but we now sort of probably call them more the civil wars because there were so many wars and they took part right across the British Isles, the Isles. It's now thought that overall it's probably the bloodiest per capita war in the last 1,000 years of British history. Like many civil wars, there seems to be a horrible edge of families divided, really grotesque war crimes as either side get appalled with the treatment of some incident, and actually Stanley finds himself in the middle of one of those episodes I'll talk about in a second. But initially it begins with a kind of political dispute. Charles I, his favourites are unpopular, his new religious ideas are unpopular. He's got an archbishop called Laud who's introducing more Catholic ideas into the Protestant liturgy, which doesn't sound that important to us, but was hugely important at the time, particularly in Scotland, hugely unpopular in Scotland. A war in Scotland actually started by these religious reforms, forced Charles to go to Parliament. They said, well, you can have some money, but there's going to be a lot of conditions on that. He was not prepared to deal with them. Eventually he fled from London, raised the royal stand and said, now these people are rebels against me. That followed around 10 years of appalling violence. And men like the 7th Earl were followers of Charles. They were critical of Charles, but also realised that if it was going to come to a fight, they chose him over the force of Parliament. That as the war went on, grew increasingly kind of radicalised. And it ends famously with King Charles I having his head chopped off, which at the beginning of the war, many even who opposed him would not have dreamt that that's where it would end up. And so the 7th Earl, he took part in a battle which led to the fall of the town of Bolton, and its people suffered terribly. And the 7th Earl was blamed. Memories were long-lived. And after the defeat of Charles I, Parliament would go round looking for some of Charles's most ardent followers, yeah.
And rounded them up.
Yes, he was nabbed.
James the 7th Earl was beheaded on the 15th of October 1651 at the Market Cross in Churchgate, Bolton. He died outside the Old Man and Scythe Inn, owned at the time by the Earl of Derby's family, which still stands today. There are a few notable items still surviving today that act as sobering reminders of his death and reflect an example of living history. There still exists the 7th Earl's execution relics, skullcap, gauntlet gloves, brass spur, linen collar, and the execution stool he sat on just before his death. And in the same inn survives a chair with the inscription 15th of October 1651. In this chair, James, 7th Earl of Derby, sat at the Old Man and Scythe Inn, Churchgate, Bolton, immediately prior to his execution. Although this would not be the end of the Stanleys, the 7th Earl's death would act as a historical bookmark for the family. The estates gradually fell into ruin, reflecting the fading status of the Earls of Derby. As alluded to earlier in the life of Ferdinando, a growing art form was sweeping across Britain, and the Stanley family were at the forefront. This was theatrical performance, and it was a vital way people like the Earls of Derby practiced self-fashioning, explored contemporary politics, and gave burgeoning artists the ability to hone their craft. In the following clip, I sit down with Professor Elspeth Graham, where we discuss the background to this a bit further, and I learn about how some of history's greatest artists came to cross the threshold of Knowsley Hall.
Really, there were two sorts of performance in the late 16th century, so in Shakespeare's lifetime, really. There was the traditional sort of performance, which was all thanks to the noble or aristocratic families like the Earls of Derby, also the Earl of Essex, the Earl of Leicester, all the big name families, as well as Queen Elizabeth herself and her court. And they used to have troupes of players who would perform for them in their houses or palaces. And these performances were hugely important because they were the glue that held together the royal court or the northern court of the Earls of Derby. All the people who visited, all of the important people who came would be entertained by players of various sorts. But it didn't have a salaried bureaucracy to run it as modern government does. It had a system of patronage. And so the Queen, or in the north, the Earls of Derby, would be patrons to people who came and produced literature, plays, entertainments for them. And these entertainments were, I call them the glue, because really they brought together all the people who would be visiting, all the aspects of the administration of the region or the country. And they were fun. They got people enjoying themselves together, but they often had quite serious themes that actually it's a way of having almost an undercover discussion of the politics of the day.
Without a doubt, Knowsley's greatest artistic association comes directly from the theatre, and that is through Shakespeare. It's been a family legend for many centuries that Shakespeare came to Knowsley Hall and premiered one of his greatest works for the Stanley family, A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is said to have taken place at Greenwich Palace for the wedding of William, 6th Earl of Derby, and Elizabeth de Vere. In the next segment, I asked Professor Elspeth Graham and Dr. Vanessa Wilkie about this. whether elements of the play could have been directly inspired by members of the Stanley family, and what they think about the infamous claim that an Earl of Derby could have been the true author of Shakespeare's works.
Let's talk about the Sixth Earl and his wedding. How true is it that A Midsummer Night's Dream was premiered at his wedding? Do we absolutely know that?
No, there's a 50-50 chance.
Okay,
I like to think it did.
cut
I
past
like to think it did.
Yeah.
But
According to family myth, I've always told my children that, Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream was premiered at
well, family myth is an oral history is very strong. So there are other contenders, but let's say that
William Kemp, we know, was wearing the livery at the fourth Earl of Derby's wedding. But am I right in thinking that Shakespeare actually wrote particular characters for William Kemp? He'd sort of become his lead actor at that time. I understood he wrote the position of Bottom for him.
quite probably, yes. I mean, William Kemp was important, especially in Shakespeare's early career. I mean, he was his clown, his fool.
There isn't time in this episode to talk about the thorny problem of the authorship. I don't want to go into it, but I think we should say why we're not going into it, because there is so many different strands to who it could be. I mean, I find it rather bizarre that my forebear, Sir Henry Neville, is alleged to have been the person who penned the plays, William Shakespeare. What do you think about all these conspiracy theories? Because these academics get really wound up about who they believe wrote the plays. What do you think is the perceived wisdom nowadays?
I think the perceived wisdom is that all of that is a bit bonkers.
I
No
love that.
offense to your ancestors.
I've never actually, there's this book written, The Truth Will Out by John Casson, and he's absolutely convinced that Sir Henry Neville, because he was an ambassador and well-travelled, wrote the plays. I've never, ever said that.
I mean, there have been lots of arguments, and when you read these books, they can be very, very convincing. But I think the thing that clinches it for me is that all the other playwrights that we know, Marston, Middleton, and so on, they were friends of Shakespeare. They knew who he was. They didn't think it was someone else. And he collaborated with them.
Well, there you have it. The Stanleys probably can't lay claim to writing the works of Shakespeare, but the 4th, 5th and 6th Earls of Derby certainly provided a grand northern court that patronised one of Britain's finest writers, providing a fertile scene for actors and playwrights to flourish, create and perform plays, many of which are still read and performed today. In recognition of this fact, in 2022, we were lucky enough to see the opening of the new Prescott Playhouse after 20 years of fundraising and planning by Shakespeare North. Together with my husband and with funding from Knowsley Council, the Liverpool City Regional Authority and also the government, we witnessed the culmination of a collaboration to build a replica Elizabethan theatre built by traditional techniques with a 420-seat main auditorium. Its inspiration was the historical Prescott Playhouse, which existed between the mid-1590s and 1609 in Prescott, and is based on the Inigo Jones drawings of the cockpit at court held at Worcester College, Oxford. In this final clip, we discuss this incredible new project, the relationship between this part of the world and Elizabethan theatre, and why it's so important we acknowledge the cultural and artistic traditions of Merseyside and Lancashire.
When Liverpool was going to be capital of culture in 2008,
yes.
It was announced in 2003, and my colleague Matthew Jordan had the idea that we should do something to celebrate this by making a theatre to celebrate Knowsley and Prescott's Elizabethan heritage. It took 18 years to develop it until it became a real theatre. There is now a reproduction 16th and 17th century theatre, which is enclosed in a modern building, which itself is enclosed in a performance garden to celebrate the history of Knowsley's really 16th and 17th century theatrical importance and the whole performance culture, which really people have known about very much until now.
Well, we were very lucky because we had some amazing actors who got behind it. To just mention some of them, I think there was Vanessa Redgrave, Helen Mirren, who else was Anthony Holden?
Judi Dench has been
Judi Dench.
incredibly supportive,
Yes.
yes. And more locally known actresses, Kim Cattrall, actually from Sex and the City, who comes from Prescott.
Yes.
The Shakespeare North Playhouse is in Prescott because it brings together precisely this treasure of a history of the little town of Prescott, this tiny little town that had this mysterious, wonderful Elizabethan theatre, with the Earls of Derby and their very illustrious and very long-lived theatrical patronage. Local people have really got into this story and love it, and they sort of own it, which is right. The Earls of Derby, Earls and Countesses of Derby,
Yes, please.
own the story, but so do the people. And it's really the interaction between them that the new playhouse is meant to reproduce.
The new Prescott Playhouse is a fantastic example of how the history of theatrical performance, not only in Knowsley Hall, but all of Merseyside, lives on today, safeguarded for the future. People will come and go. Buildings can be built and then torn down, but great artistic works can stay with us forever. Following on from this idea, we at Knowsley Hall have always been dedicated to preserving great works of art. The Derby collection is a collection of significant works of art and antiques that the Stanley family are custodians of. These can be family relics from battles, paintings, furniture, and much more. We were lucky enough that the 10th Earl's art collecting archives still exist to this day in this library. They have been invaluable in providing us with details of dates of acquisitions and past attributions of works of art. And these were the source documents for Dr. Richard Stevens, who I'm about to speak to in this next clip. The collection was further catalogued by Sir George Scharf for the 14th and 15th Earls between 1864 and 1875. In this clip, I sit down with him and Dr. Stephen Lloyd, where we discuss the range of artworks that the Derby collection comprises.
The Derby collection is a large and extensive collection of fine and decorative arts. It's got this major library and this very important family archive. So the art collection is particularly strong in paintings, oil paintings, both old master paintings by the great European painters of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, but also really fine British paintings, particularly landscapes, especially portraits. So most of the great masters of the 18th century and the 17th century and early 19th century are represented in the collection. And that is a living collection going right up to the current day. So we pretty much got portraits of all the major earls and countesses right up to the current day. It's also very significant for its equestrian portraits. It's one of the finest collections of horse paintings in Britain, one of the best in the world. In particular, there is one work by George Stubbs, the most famous of all equestrian artists. And there's also very important landscape paintings, especially in the early 18th century, by the Flemish itinerant artist Peter Tillemans and a local Lancashire artist called Joshua Molyneux. And that tradition of landscape paintings and commissioning of landscape paintings is continued by the current generation of the family. The 7th Earl in the 1640s had 3 old paintings on panel, a perspective piece, which is probably a Dutch church interior, a Virgin and Child with the Saviour, which is Christ, but also a Magdalene by Leonardo da Vinci, which was valued at £100, a huge sum, so more expensive than the most valuable set of tapestries. All 3 of those paintings were lost in the Civil War, and they were dispersed through dowries through the daughters. So we've been able to trace them to a certain degree, even into the end of the 19th century, but at that point the trail has gone cold. But we would dearly like to recover or re-find this missing painting of the Mary Magdalene by Leonardo da Vinci.
During your time as curator, I think probably one of the most significant finds for you, or authentications really, was the Rembrandt. So shall we talk about the Rembrandt?
It's a panel painting of a head and shoulders portrait of what's called in Dutch a tronie. It's a study of a model, and he's bearded and he's wearing Middle Eastern dress, he's wearing a turban. And what hadn't been spotted, and it's very faint, is that actually it's signed Rembrandt F, which means the Latin for fake it, which means he made it. And it's dated.
Not fake it as in he faked it. For those of us who don't speak Latin.
It's then dated 163 and then it's damaged the last. So it's 1630. And we think it's either 1636 or 1307. So this was a very big clue that this painting might be by Rembrandt.
In a place like Knowsley Hall, you never know what treasures are hiding in the halls and the vaults. An example of this living history is the rediscovering of Adrian van der Werf's beautifully painted oil panel, Christ and the Women of Samaria. This was found behind a cupboard in an attic bedroom at Knowsley Hall, of all places. Although some great works of art remain elusive and potentially lost within the Derby collection, there is always hope they can be found once more. So, we've established that families like the Stanleys were very important for collecting great works of art. But what about the artists who were creating them? How did they learn their trade? How did they view great works for inspiration? How did they make a living back then? And is it possible estates like Knowsley Hall were crucial in the life of an artist?
What we call a gallery nowadays is something where you go and buy and sell art. But there seemed to be a sort of academy at Knowsley in this period as well.
Yeah.
Do I understand correctly that living artists were encouraged to come and paint the old master paintings?
They were. And this is the most intriguing aspect of Knowsley and also of what the archive tells us about what it meant to be a painter in those days. Because certainly the 10th Earl, just as with Winstanley, he nurtured the careers of several art students and young painters. We know that George Stubbs, who is now known as really the greatest equestrian artist in English painting, studied at Knowsley in 1736, so at the very end of the 10th Earl's life.
He was sacked by Winstanley because he kept bringing dead animals into the house because he wanted to do dissection on them, which is why his paintings are so brilliant. He completely understood anatomy.
He did. And in fact, perhaps of all the sort of hundreds of purchases that the 10th Earl made that are recorded in Edward Stanley's account books, the most interesting one is in 1726, I think it was, he buys a skeleton from a surgeon. And this was to enable these young students to learn about anatomy and good figure drawing.
How fascinating. So tell us about some of the paintings which were actually bought and the prices that...
The most expensive painting was Guido Rini of Adam and Eve being expelled from Eden. He spent £630 on that painting in 1724, which from surviving records is the largest sum spent on any painting in England to that date, apart from a few really major works in the Commonwealth sales from the Royal Collection.
And I mean, there were some really major artworks. I mean, we haven't mentioned this very great Rembrandt.
No, absolutely. I mean, we don't know where it was from, but Winstanley bought it, I think, in 1727, presumably on the London art market.
Of Belshazzar's Feast.
Yeah, indeed.
Which is now in the National Gallery in London and is being enjoyed by millions of people every year.
But it was the 10th Earl paid £126 for it, which it wasn't even one of his top 10 most expensive paintings.
No, indeed.
To wrap up this particular section, we're going to move away from the Derby collection and the lives of artists as a whole, and onto one particular artist, Edward Lear, who really is inextricably linked with Knowsley Hall. Edward Lear met the 13th Earl of Derby when working at the London Zoological Society, the same society that later became London Zoo. He would come to this estate to paint exotic animals for the benefits of scientific learning at the request of the 13th Earl. He flourished under the guidance and patronage of the 13th Earl. He so loved being at Knowsley that he came to view it as home, frequently painting here, and he would even write the classic children's nonsense poem, The Owl and the Pussycat, in the nurseries of the house, in order to entertain the entire family. In this final clip, Dr. Richard Stevens and Dr. Stephen Lloyd describe the intimate relationship between patron and artist and how fundamental that relationship was to the creation of great works.
Lear comes to Knowsley in 1831. He's the 13th Earl, meets him. He's president of the Zoological Society of London. He meets him there. He spots him as a talent. He's working with the great illustrator John Gould. And he basically invites the young Edward Lear in his early 20s to come up to Knowsley, come and live at Knowsley, and come and paint the exotic animals and birds, which Lear does. I mean, for him, these are the happiest years of his life in the 1830s. But after 6 years, Lear's eyesight is beginning to go because these are highly detailed watercolours. Every feather is painted, every bit of fur is painted. He asks the 13th Earl whether he might pay for him to go to Italy. And the 13th Earl says yes, and then the family put together the funding for him to go to Italy. They expect him probably to stay for a year. He stays for 10 years in central Italy, and he's based in Rome, and he's travelling all over central Italy, the Apennines, the Marche, and he produces an extraordinary group of watercolours. And again, happily, many of those watercolours are at Knowsley, and they're a real jewel of the collection. And the Derbys remain loyal to Lear, and they always buy at the sales. And in fact, this loyalty is rewarded because when Edward Lear dies in San Remo in northwestern Italy in the 1880s, he gives the 15th Earl first refusal to be given watercolours from the estate of Edward Lear, and those are still in the Derby collection.
I think that sentiment is a really powerful note to end this particular section on. Knowsley Hall was not just a place where art was collected. It was a place where both art and artists were created. Let's move on to another very important part of the Stanley family legacy. So far, we've explored their history from war and conflict to the family's contribution to theatre and the arts. But when you hear the word Derby, it's likely that one thing springs to mind: horse racing. I'm proud to say that the Stanleys have one of the most famous and successful histories in the sport of horse racing, which we're going to explore in the following clips. I was joined by Edward, my husband, 19th Earl of Derby, and Alexandra Mason, where we first discussed what exactly horse racing is and how the origins of the great Epsom Derby is directly connected to the 12th Earl of Derby.
The Derby is a race, one of the 5 classics, as they're called, the highest level of racing, and it's run over 1.5 miles at the beginning of June, originally on a Wednesday and now on a Saturday, and that has spread out all around the world. This is the Derby, but you have the Irish Derby, the French Derby, the Kentucky Derby, and you go out into donkey derbies and everything, other type of derby as well.
And the Derby, I think I'm right in saying, is the race that everyone wants to win. Of the 5 classics on the English calendar, it's the Derby that is the big one. It really, really matters.
Every breeder happily still wants to win the Derby.
And how far back can you trace your, or our, actually, historic association with the sport of kings?
I think it goes back a very, very long way. I talk about the family being at Knowsley for 600 years. As Earl of Derby, that's the title carried by the head of the Stanley family. And the Stanley family were foresters on the Wirral. And the Wirral, for those that don't know, is the peninsula that lies between the River Dee and the River Mersey. So that's Chester on one side and Liverpool on the other side. And there was racing on the sands back there in the 1500s. The family had a home called Leasowe Castle, and there is clear evidence of racing right back to those early days.
Really, the family became synonymous with racing with the 12th Earl. Would you like to tell us how the Epsom Derby started?
Epsom is in South London, and the family came into a house there called the Oaks. And I think probably unique in sports anywhere, they started a race for the ladies before the chaps. In 1779, there was the first running of the Oaks, named after the house, and my forebear won it with a horse called Bridget. Now, that was thought to be all rather a good thing, so they had a debate and thought, well, maybe the boys should have a race under similar conditions. So it's a 1.5 mile race, and so there was a dinner party at the Oaks where they decided to toss a coin over what it was going to be called, and Sir Charles Bunbury lost the toss, so it became called the Derby, but on the other hand, he did all right because his horse, Diarmid, won the first running of it.
So when did our family win their first Derby?
Well, it took a few more years, 1787, so the 8th running of the race when Sir Peter Teazle won.
This extraordinary historical detail in many ways foreshadows the success the Stanleys would have in the sport. Moving through history now, the 14th Earl, who was Prime Minister 3 times to Queen Victoria, and who we will dedicate a section of this documentary to later on, was also an extraordinarily accomplished breeder and winner in horse racing, just like his grandfather, the 12th Earl. Today, the many stunning and treasured trophies from the 14th Earl's successes reside in Knowsley Hall. The Stanleys are tied to the very history of the Derby, having created its name and initiated the race for fillies called the Oaks. But who stands apart as the greatest in the family's history? Well, perhaps the Stanleys' greatest ever racehorse owner was my great-grandfather-in-law, Edward, the 17th Earl of Derby. In this next section, we talk about some of his major achievements and his most famous and favourite horse, Hyperion, a horse so iconic that he left a lasting impression on a young Queen Elizabeth II.
My great-grandfather, he is quite simply a titan of racing. He was the Racing Post's person of the 20th century.
I think probably we'd all agree that Hyperion was the 17th Earl's greatest horse.
Well, Hyperion is a truly wonderful racehorse. He won the Derby of 1933, trained by George Lambton, who described him as the greatest little pit pony ever to win the Derby.
Why was he called a pit pony?
Because he was so small. He really was very small, but you could just see from the wonderful old black and white, slightly jumpy footage of it that it was very obvious from a very long way out that Hyperion was going to win the race. And indeed, our young queen is Princess Elizabeth, born in 1926, and so she met Hyperion as a relatively young girl, and when being told by her nanny to wash her hands, she said, "I've stroked Hyperion, I'm not going to wash my hands for a week." This has always been one. Sometimes you wonder if these stories are myths, but as you and I know, the Queen, when we asked her, did validate that, and so we know it's absolutely true.
Although it's unimaginable that we could replicate my great-grandfather-in-law's success, I saw and experienced an unbelievable roller coaster of fortune firsthand with our own thoroughbred mare, Ouija Board, who was a dual classic winner and won 7 Group 1 races. This brings immense pride to both my husband and I. So, in this final section, we talk about her life, achievements, and what it was like to watch the mare in a million race all over the world.
So tell us about how you had these successes.
Well, I was really extraordinarily lucky. My younger brother, Peter Stanley, who runs the Stanley House stud in Newmarket for us, as well as being owner-manager of his own stud, the New England stud in Newmarket. And we had a mare called Selection Board who had never quite lived up to expectation. And Peter said, "I think you should mate your mare with Cape Cross." And so it came to move her into training, and flat horses typically come into training as 2-year-olds. And so that's the time when you try and find a name for them. And this is where you came in, my darling, as Cape Cross out of Selection Board, and you said, "What about Ouija Board?"
So Ouija Board basically dominated our lives for 3 years. We had 3 young children, and we were on a plane every 3 or 4 weeks, really following top-level sport. And she raced on 22 occasions. She won how much money in prize money?
She won about £3 million, which made her the winningmost mare in history. And that was a record that she held for about 20 years afterwards.
Ouija Board was a massive part of our lives for over 20 years. But beyond the prize money or cups, what made us most proud was that we felt like we'd done our bit to honour the legacy of the other horse racing greats in our family, from the 18th Earl all the way back to the 12th. The Stanleys have always been competitive in this great sport, and I hope that legacy continues long into the future. As previously touched upon, a significant horse racing titan in our family was the 14th Earl. He was a man of exceptional intellect, character, and was one of the most significant political figures in all of Victorian Britain. a man who abolished slavery in the colonies of the British Empire in 1833, improved primary education in Ireland, and forged a legacy as a principled, forward-thinking man. An individual that is claiming his rightful place in history as one of the greatest statesmen this country ever produced. I sat down with Dr. Geoffrey Hicks and Dr. Jennifer Davey to explore the 14th Earl's life and contributions to democracy a bit further.
Full name, Edward George Geoffrey Smith Stanley, 14th Earl of Derby, as you say, although he has a long political career before he becomes the 14th Earl. He is, to date, the longest serving leader of one of Britain's best surviving political parties, the Conservative Party, which he leads for over 20 years. He is one of only 4 prime ministers who have served 3 or more separate periods in office, and indeed he was the first to be serving 3 times separately as prime minister. The 14th Earl was a man of profound and deep religious faith, but he was also a man who was profoundly religiously tolerant of other religious beliefs, of other religious traditions, both Christian and non-Christian, which, as I think we'll come on to discuss, was important in the way he conducts his legislative career.
So one of his first postings is as Chief Secretary for Ireland, and he understands, I think, quite acutely that Ireland has a series of challenges around religion, challenges around how the land is owned and organised and taxed, how the education system works. And so one of the things he does as Chief Secretary is try to make things a little bit better, and in particular to try and bring together disparate groups and disparate interests. And in particular, he does quite a bit of work around Irish education, which I think is one of his kind of lasting legacies in the country.
Well, I think, didn't he set up primary education in Ireland?
Yeah, he really sees education as kind of one of those kind of foundational stones of how you might make a nation better.
And one of the greatest and most significant contributions to politics in many ways was the abolition of slavery bill that he introduced in 1833, which slavery had been abolished in 1807, I think, and that's much more known about as by Wilberforce. But what actually Derby did was he abolished slavery in the colonies, which stopped it at source.
There had been a sustained and very powerful campaign, particularly on the Whig side of politics, for the wider abolition of slavery in the British Empire. So there was an important political imperative for him to deliver that change as a minister in Grey's government. But it was something that chimed with his own moral sense of the world. You mentioned earlier his tour of America, and it was very clear that the experience of observing the reality of slavery in his travels in America had really woken him up to what a blot it was on humanity's landscape, and he wanted to do something about that.
And he's really descriptive about his horror of the slavery. And there's one moment where he says in his diaries, "You never know, one day this country might have a black president." And he wrote that when he was 24 in 1824. And it's just truly, you know, when I read that, I cried. It was so meaningful for me that a young person in our family could write something so historically important. And just going back a few years, in 1858, he passed a couple of acts, particularly showing his religious tolerance and empathy with all creeds and all colours. Would you like to talk a bit about that, Jeff?
Yes, so perhaps it would be most useful to talk about the Jewish Disabilities Act, so-called. And the Jewish Disabilities Act enabled Jews to sit in Parliament for the first time. It's one of the major marks of toleration in the mid-Victorian period. So again, it's a conservative aristocrat who is passing one of the more enlightened pieces of legislation of the mid-19th century.
When studying the life of the 14th Earl, his time travelling as a young man cannot be overstated. His first trip riding from Knowsley to Naples was eye-opening. It was his first foray into seeing the world outside of the exclusive milieu he was used to within Knowsley Hall, Derby House, Eton and Oxford. His second trip was more the awakening of the man and his moral sensibility. What he saw and experienced travelling through the United States and Canada shaped him and set him on a lifelong pursuit against injustice. It broadened his perspective on the capacity and potential of humanity, especially when people get a chance at education. It also outlined to him the importance of respecting all human life through his own deep faith and tolerance of all faiths, creeds, and races. The campaigns he was struggling for then have largely been accepted now, and the rights he fought for then are ones we now take for granted. But the 14th Earl was a visionary in his own time. One of the things that was spoken about in the previous clip was the Earl's introduction of the Jewish Relief Act in 1858, which entitled practising Orthodox Jews to take up their seats in the Parliament. The first MP to have benefited from this act was Lionel de Rothschild, whose portrait you are now seeing and which hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. Today, these travels, journeys that would directly influence the lives of people throughout the empire and the colonies, are preserved through the rediscovery of his European and North American travel journals from 1820 to 25. These were found in our library and are exceptionally significant historical documents illuminating one of the great formative periods of a man who shaped Great Britain during the Victorian era. If you're interested in learning more about this incredible man, I would really recommend visiting our website and ordering a copy of his travel journals. Although health caught up with the 14th Earl and he resigned, I think that final decision is again a mark of his character. He did not try to hang on to power. Instead, he could see that he contributed enough to Britain and its empire. In a life dedicated to serving his people, he moved on. So we're nearing the end of this documentary now. We've covered the early history of the Stanleys, their contribution to the arts and theatre, their successes on the turf, and we've explored one of the most exceptional statesmen that's ever led Great Britain. But now we're going to the surrounding landscape of Knowsley Hall and the natural world. For our final section, we're going to explore the contributions to science and zoology made right here in the safari park that we still have today. And most importantly, we're going to discuss the future of sustainability on this estate. But before we talk about the future, we must go back to the past. Knowsley has been a park since medieval times. There's been a structure at Knowsley for many centuries, beginning as a hunting lodge. That was until the 1500s, when the first Earl of Derby built the royal lodgings for his stepson, who was King Henry VII. Afterwards, the gardens were expanded, but it wasn't till England's greatest ever gardener arrived at Knowsley that a true transformation of the gardens took place. Capability Brown is a name synonymous with heritage in this country, and his contributions to this estate can still be seen to this day. I sat down with Dr. David Jakes and John Phibbs to discuss why he is so highly regarded by history and what exactly he did at the estate.
Weirdly, his Christian name is as weird as capability. I mean, because it's Lancelot Brown. He was born to a tenant farmer come bailiff up in Kirkharle in Northumberland and left school 14, but every day he would go to school through the great estate of Wallington, which was being improved at the time. So from his early years, he was very familiar with the idea of improving landscape. And then he ended up at Stowe, which was the greatest garden, the most innovative garden of the time, and he stays there for 10 years. And then he sets up 1751 independently, based in London, in Hammersmith. And by the mid-1750s, he's already being acclaimed as a genius. And I think this is partly because I think he always retained his Northumbrian accent. He never pretended to be anything except sort of quasi-working class, peasant or stock. In the two famous portraits of him, he's wearing basically a farm coat. And I think he kind of rose on the crest of a wave of interest in Old England, Englishness, moral virtue rising from the innocence of the working classes, so that he was taken on as a character. But he was undoubtedly fantastically proficient at what he did.
When the 12th Earl got married...
For the first time,
both Brown and Robert Adam, the famous architect, were invited to come here and suggest improvements. And Adam created the dairy, which is to the south of the house, and made other suggestions. Brown, apparently, according to his account book, made some plans. One of them was for the kitchen garden, which is on the north side of the house. And then he did a plan, now lost, for the south and east side of the house. But disaster struck because the Countess ran off with this notorious rake. And the 12th Earl was outraged. He was obviously incredibly angry. So work stopped. No more Adam, no more Brown. And it wasn't until his second marriage to this comic actress, about 20 years later, she got him to restart making the Brown garden.
So actually we've got the 13th Earl to thank for
the present part.
For the present
Well,
part.
I would say the structure is, the underlying structure, the bones of it are still Brown and the earlier design.
So Brown's work can still be seen in many of the features of the beautiful gardens and landscape here today, including the ponds and the kitchen garden. When considering Brown's work on Knowsley, it's evident there's been an appreciation of nature at Knowsley for decades. But one Earl didn't just want to appreciate the nature, he wanted to study and understand it. The 13th Earl was a politician, a farmer, a naturalist, and really he was a scientist. This was the man who'd encountered a young Edward Lear and employed him to draw watercolours of exotic animals. This was also a man who paid huge sums of money to transport animals from all across the world to Knowsley for the purpose of scientific study.
I mean, tell us how the menagerie started. So the 13th Earl started it because he just had this tremendous love of animals.
The 13th Earl of Derby's Avery menagerie was undoubtedly the largest private zoo ever in the entire world. I know I have checked this in America, because I thought, well, there must be an American zoo somewhere in private hands, or possibly one in maybe South Africa. Surely somebody had a bigger zoo, but no, the figures come back and it's always Knowsley. And it was full of animals, so fields full of antelopes and elands, just proper fields with proper grazing animals.
Proper herd
doing
sizes.
Proper herd things, and not caged in horrible little, backyards of things. He had water birds on the several ponds, and then he had things like the Stanley cranes, which these beautiful cranes that were named after him before he became Lord Derby.
And so how did the Earl acquire all these actual specimens, these animals? Did he have a network of agents?
It's astonishing how much money he must have spent on this. I mean, the living menagerie in Avery here must have had about 30 staff from what Thomas More said. So that was just the staff here. And then he sent people all over the world.
So he would send these explorers out.
Yeah.
And he would pay for them, their accommodation and their transport. And then they would acquire animals to be brought back to Knowsley.
Some of which were still living. And that must have cost so much money.
So, in the past, Knowsley Hall has been a place of science and conservation. But what about now? Well, the 13th Earl's vision for Knowsley Hall continues to live on, literally and principally. The aviaries and the menageries that were built by him are still on the estate and remain a constant reminder of his contributions to science and the study of zoology. And both my husband and I have always tried to build on the legacy of the 13th Earl with the modern-day safari park. In the final clip of this documentary, we will discuss the concept behind the safari park, what animals we now have on the estate, and we also speak about the crucial conservation projects we're involved in.
We're lucky to have a very large safari park just literally outside Liverpool, where we're very much following in the conservation attention to detail that Edward Lear and the 13th Earl started. It's the same thing. We try and keep to large herd sizes.
Yeah.
We've got an enormous amount of land that they can roam over. We have Cape elands, alpacas, lions, tigers, rhinos, meerkats, baboons, bush dogs, bongos, giraffe. And everything we do is to make them feel free. So I think it's a very lovely environment for them to live in. And very similarly to the 13th Earl, we're very involved in threatened species and we support numerous research groups. You know, I'm always interested just how many degrees our employees have. And they're going off, and we now support the Wild Camel Protection Foundation, and we send some of our employees into the Gobi Desert. We're involved in protection for forests and wildlife in Cambodia. So very much under that same feeling, we're still continuing what the 13th Earl set up in the menagerie. And we're also doing our own bit to breed tigers for the future. So we have the Amur tiger here. We have a breeding program.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably one of the most important things we're doing at the moment. It's absolutely crucial work because they're so critically endangered.
Yeah.
For me, the Knowsley Safari embodies this concept of living natural history. It's an association to our past and an attempt to honour the legacy of our ancestor. It remains on the same soil and grounds of the original menagerie built by the 13th Earl. It shares the same vision for how to further our own education as a species and how to build a better world for all life on this planet. But it is also living and evolving today. I think this is the right note to end on. We have spent this documentary talking about history and preserving the past. But if we don't care for the life on this planet and for the natural world, there will be no meaningful future for our descendants. It is paramount that places like Knowsley Hall protect and safeguard the future as well as the past for future generations. I've been your host, Caroline, the Countess of Derby. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to welcoming you to Knowsley Safari and Knowsley Hall soon. Goodbye.